A special thank you to our sponsor partners, Yahoo and TEGNA Foundation, and now our moderator.
You can feel the vibes just from that intro. Thank you to NAB President Dorothy Tucker for that introduction, and a warm welcome to all of you for joining us here on this Saturday for what we hope to be an engaging and insightful discussion on what it means to be a Black man all around the world, how perceptions are changing. And I think what's most important that you'll get out of this conversation is that the answers to those concepts are not uniform. We intend in this conversation, speaking about a global perspective on Black men, to cover a number of topics, whether it's reaction to the murder of George Floyd here in the US last year, how can Black men be better allies to women around the world, what are the differences in how we're treated depending on the continent we're in, another hint on that, it's not uniform, and there's also colorism to that degree. And how can we as Black men fight back and get more equal footing on the global stage? You're seeing the awesome panel that we've assembled. I'm going to introduce each of them for you and ask them what time it is where they are, because really this stretches around the globe, and what makes them different. We have Jabril Diallo in Dakar, Senegal, with the African Renaissance and Diaspora Network. Jabril, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, what time is it where you are?
It's 6:04 p.m. here, Saturday.
Not too late. I also want to welcome Lennox Samuels as a Bangkok-based journalist in Thailand. Lennox, welcome. How late are you staying up for this?
It is 1 o'clock, bit past 1 o'clock in the morning, Sunday.
Thank you for your, what is it, longevity and perseverance to stay up this late. And we also want to give a warm welcome to Hussein Hubaidin Zamzam. He's in Melbourne, Australia, with the Australian Multicultural Media Centre. I think he's winning the reversal clock competition. Welcome, Hussein, and what time is it where you are?
It's about 4:15 in the morning.
Okay, so maybe you win that staying up late prize. I also want to remind everyone who signed up to be a part of this, you see the hashtag on your screen. Use it, hashtag Inspire Black Men, as you listen to what our panelists are discussing, as you share this on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. We hope that this is the beginning of a long-term conversation that we hope each of our guests will continue to carry as the days and weeks go forward. Also, your questions will be a part of this. Go ahead, and there's apparently a chat feature that the Black Male Media Project team has worked to develop so that you can throw your questions in as we have this conversation, and we'll make sure to get your questions to this esteemed panel as we talk about what's happening in the world. The first question I want to throw out is for each of you, so we'll just kind of go around and get responses, considering that it has been more than a year since the murder of George Floyd. Here in the US, that horrific video, which I personally cannot watch. I haven't watched the entire video because it's traumatic, but it led to the largest social protest ever recorded, which is saying something here in the US, also triggered demonstrations around the world. Key question being, despite Derek Chauvin, the officer responsible, being found guilty, has anything really changed? Here in the US, police reform legislation is stalling in Congress. It doesn't look like that will happen. But what is the story in Australia, in Asia, in West Africa? So let's begin with Jabril Diallo. What changes have you noticed specifically in response to the murder of George Floyd?
There have been tremendous changes at two levels. One, the youth of Africa generally look up to the African-American community in terms of synergy, so that that kind of discrimination that has happened was a sea change in terms of impact on especially the youth. The second thing is the murder of George Floyd brought up some old tensions between former colonizers and Africans themselves. Therefore, it brought about much more to the fore the issues of respect for human rights, violations, and also issues of poverty, hunger, and other matters.
And Lennox, in Asia, Bangkok, Hong Kong are just some cities that are standing out to me where we did see demonstrations in response to what happened here in the US. Have you noticed a change? Has anything changed as far as the experience of people of color there?
Alas, no, in a word. I think the best way to describe it is there has been some considerable sort of acting out and sympathetic demonstrations in Hong Kong, in Australia, in Indonesia, Singapore, Japan, of varying degrees. Thousands in Australia, hundreds in Japan, dozens in Korea. In many cases, with people using this opportunity not to talk about Black men or Black people per se, but to use it as an entree to talking about racial issues in their countries. For example, in Australia, talking about the problems of indigenous people. In Indonesia, the problem with Papuans, who are Black people and occupy the poorest state in Indonesia. The situation has been similar in Japan, in China, where they're talking about the plight of the Uyghurs, for example, who are some 2 million of those people are in concentration camps. But I think it would be a bit over the top to talk about there having been any substantive change in, frankly, public attitudes, and certainly not in terms of the perception, I think, or attitude toward Blacks in this region. It is a peculiar region in that you've got all these multiple ethnicities, but all of whom are essentially Asians. And whilst they have problems amongst themselves, they all tend to be racist toward Black people. In India, for example, where you've got a lot of dark-hued people, dark complexioned people, they are at considerable pains to make people understand that they may be dark-skinned, but they're Caucasians, they're not Blacks. So no, I don't think there's been any substantive change at all in this region.
And we have to let everyone listening know that in your part of the world, it's not uncommon to go to the supermarket, the grocery store, look for lotion, and actually find skin lightening cream.
Well, exactly right. And that is a $10 billion industry in this region, much of it in India. Interestingly, in India, for example, Errol, you had all these movie stars, Bollywood stars coming out with Black Lives Matter support videos, public service announcements, and yet these are the same people who were leading campaigns for skin whiteness, these actors and actresses and so on. So it's, not to put too fine a point on it, it's a bit skin deep, really.
No, that's a very good point. Here in the US, in all the major cities, you see major companies with Black Lives Matter signs and campaigns. You scratch below that surface and find out their employment practices don't necessarily match that commitment. Hussein, I want to bring you in on this conversation because as you and I were talking and preparing for this discussion, one thing that really jumped out at me is that in the Australian media landscape, there are but maybe you could count on one hand the number of Black men who are on television as journalists or anchors or correspondents and actually are represented. In your view, what was the response after the murder of George Floyd, and has anything changed to make Australia more inclusive?
Well, in the Ramadan time last month, I attended a conference for the media press in Australia to support like diversity and multicultural, to see colors in the media. But unfortunately in Australia, we don't have much color in the media. So what happened to us here when black male do a little mistake? It's a Christmas. They don't talk about great job that we've done. We adopted to the Australian society, and we've got now so many doctors and so many engineers. We've got a lot of talent, but we didn't see them in the Australian big, largest picture to see a different color. But in the last, before the instance of George Floyd, they give opportunity for a few black people in sport, in the footy, that popular game in Australia. But what I find as well now, after George, issues like most of the Australian who are rising for equal and human rights, there was coming out in a few states in Australia for a few days, and what I find here in Australia as well, the the Black Matters Life is give us most of different color, whether no matter your background, whether from Africa or you black, where so all the Indian, the indigenous of Australia, and the black background African, they all united as well with them. Some few Australian engaged. Australia, they are doing movement, and I attend a couple of conferences for the government as well to engage us as an black male. But what the issue that we've got here in Australia, most of us, we are a refugee. We came from a crisis area. And then the new generation who born here in Australia, they don't really care what you face in the area that you come from. Because say, for example, I came here a little bit, old. So I said to my kids, oh, you didn't know what I've been through to. So you have to accept what you've got. But my kids, they don't accept that. They said, Dad, that's you. You have seen that stories, but here we have a problem. Yes. So
and we should let viewers and panelists know that Hussein, you are originally from Eritrea and moved to Australia in the 90s as a refugee. So just to give a bit of context to why your kids may feel differently than you do about things, right?
Yes. So now we have, we have an issue that's a big gap between like our generation who think, oh, you bring me here, I enjoy the taste and the sweetness of Australia because I came in safe area, in a good area. But some of them, they ask me a question, you living a better life here in Australia? Of course I live a better life in Australia, but I ask you one question. Can you live without shoes in the desert like how the Aboriginal live in Western Australia or in the other region of the side of Australia? Can you do that? He said no. Same exactly. No matter someone you gave him a luxury car or luxury house, he can't just make him happy because you take him out from his area. Of course, right. I miss home. I miss my freedom. I feel like I was free, you know what I mean? Like similar like the Aboriginal, you know what I mean? When they're outside, they are free. They can do whatever nature, like the way how they
I see
grow.
What you're saying. It's almost as if the price of being part of society is not to rock the boat and not to question it. Lennox, I heard you just try to jump in and add a comment there.
Yes, I wanted to make a kind of a note of nuance in as much as this region is a very interesting region. I know a lot about Southeast Asia in particular, but Asia in general, where there's a huge issue of colorism. You mentioned it earlier, Errol, in the intro. And I think that is something that needs to be mentioned here because it's not quite racism, but it is related. One of the big problems in this region, or one of the big issues, if you like, is that everybody is running away from dark skin. You have Chinese, for example, coming on holiday to Thailand, and they're wearing windbreakers, and they're wearing shawls and coats and hats, wide-brimmed hats, to make sure they don't get darker. You've got people coming from Laos and Cambodia or people living there, and all these people are at great pains to make sure that their skin doesn't get any darker. And so there's this aversion to black skin. I have friends, for example, one friend of mine has had 3 whitening operations, if you like.
A whitening operation, a lightning procedure.
Not invasive. Let's say procedures, right?
Okay.
Where it's a whitening procedure 3 times, and he is paler than somebody from Sweden at this juncture. Now, he's very fond of me, right? And he says to me, meaning no offense, I just can't stand. I just can't stand having black skin, and he says black skin, not dark skin. So you've got this sort of parallel paranoia in regard to skin color, along with the sort of traditional racism, where for example, I'm walking along the concourse in the underground, in the subway, and a Thai woman coming toward me, and she moves her, that syndrome where you move your purse from the side nearest the black guy to the other shoulder farthest away from the black guy. Wow. And by the way, I attribute a lot of these attitudes that people have adopted to American media, to Hollywood, which has long presented black men in particular as villains and thugs and thieves, and that's projected globally, and that's the accepted attitude and identity associated with black people and black men in particular in this part of the world, even when it's not necessarily meant to offend. You see what I mean? So there's a colorism thing, and there's an embrace of movies dating back, of Hollywood dating back to early 50s movies and contemporary movies and television shows and music and so on. And that's sort of the accepted receipt of black people in much of this region. And it coexists very nicely with people who are very, very fond of Beyonce's music yeah,
they'll take the music and the culture. They just don't want the color, which is a real interesting dynamic globally.
That is exactly right.
Take a look at Sammy Sosa these days. I do want to move on to another topic. Of course, add your questions to the chat. We'll get to everyone else's questions as we at the second half of this discussion. But I want to move on to something Jabril Diallo really wanted to make sure that we include, which is how black men globally can be better allies to women. And I'm just wondering, Jabril, because you are championing this through an effort with the UN, are you inferring then that we don't already have the back of black women? We need to do better? Tell us more.
Well, the United Nations Development Program has a Human Development Report. And that Human Development Report says that no country in the world treats its women as well as it does its men. So that's point number 1. So that we live in a world dominated by men. And when it comes to decision making, power spaces, that's in the hands of men. So that when we take into account the perception of black men, we need to take into account that sea change that needs to be made. And I come quickly to the issue. We live in an environment right now where the world has been changed over the past 18 months because of the impact of COVID-19. And who has been at the front line of COVID-19? Black women. They have been very often the essential workers, and they bore the brunt of the suffering, the loss of lives there. So that we run the risk of even losing the small gains that have been made in terms of trying to bridge the gap between women and men. So that we need to look at that in terms of engaging men as allies of bridging the gender gap. And there are some interests there that could be taken into account. For instance, when we close the gender gap, the United Nations has determined that the GDP will be saved by 35% on average. so that we need to say it economically. Second point is that we need to come much earlier in the situation of young people, of boys and adolescents, in order to deal with it. Third, there's only one language that is universal, no matter where you come from. That is sport and culture. And in that connection, we're using the convening power of sport to give a red card to all forms of discrimination and violence against women and girls. And this is something where we could mobilize the international community to make sure that discrimination against women and girls is really put to a stop. We need 1 million signatures by the FIFA World Cup of 2022 in Qatar. And those who are watching here can go online, www.redcardpledge.com. So this is very, very important. Partnership between women and men to bridge the gender gap.
And what does the red card mean exactly? I know that you sent me a little image of it as well. There's a QR code. So if men want to be more supportive of women and make this pledge, what does that actually mean?
In the game of football, because we're talking about the United States, football being soccer in the United States, a red card means a very serious violation against the rules of the game. And when you get a red card, you get booted out of the field. So what we're saying is that we need to boot out of the field all forms of discrimination and violence against women and girls. And we're doing it in partnership with the United Nations. We're doing it in partnership with FIFA and others. So number one, we need to sign the pledge, but then we need to look at what is behind signing the pledge, which is to fight all forms of gender-based violence in the world. And gender-based violence is not just in Africa, it's all over the world, as the Human Development Report has indicated.
Lennox, how are gender roles interpreted where you are? Are things as equal? Are there efforts to make them more equal when it comes to men, specifically men of color, supporting women of color?
Again, it's a complicated proposition in this part of the world. Many Asians, Southeast Asians, and let me be specific, Thais, Cambodians, Lao, Filipinos, they tend to be comparatively passive culturally. And within that context, men tend to take the lead. On the other hand, when you have things like demonstrations, for example, in Thailand against various coups over the years, a lot of those are led by women and girls and women students in particular. But I would not venture to say that the roles are equal in this part of the world. It's not quite the Middle East, but there's a considerable way to go yet in terms of gender equality here. It's very much a patriarchal society in terms of power, in terms of social organization, families and so on. It's a matriarchal society, but that's sort of at the homestead, if you like. It doesn't extend as much to the geopolitical issues. So there's a continuing imbalance there that's improving, but it's nowhere near where it needs to be. And as you know, we've had in this region a number of female prime ministers, presidents, and so on, including in Thailand. But that is not exactly typical.
And Hussein, what about in Australia? You know, in my view, Australia, similar to South Africa, are also cultures in the Southern Hemisphere where there is this value of machismo, or being macho, and men really being the ones who not only play rugby and you know, European football, but take command and take the lead, despite women being just as skilled and as qualified. In Australia, how are you seeing it?
Actually, in Australia, it's a bit different. Like even we have, especially as a black man, we've got a problem. We think that Australia is like a powerful for a woman countries. Like here in Australia, women have a power. She can raise her hand if anything happening. So even there is a lot of complaint here from a men that you know, they're giving right more to the women than rather than men. For us, actually, as a black male here, we had a bit of culture, you know, like the women serve for a man, and a woman should have you know, more that as we had in background. But when we came here, we faced issue that, because remember one thing, in Australia there is no black, and before 40 years, just we came in the late 20 or 30 years, more you know, diversity and multicultural in Australia. There is no many black people. So now to adopt here to the Australian society for the male, we had a bit of issues and hiccup. But for a woman, I think they are a very success here in Australia. I know we've got a rugby as well, the Australian sport for women, and we've got as well all the sport. I think there is no issue here in Australia for a woman. The issue only for a man to find a job, or the way how women look at him as well here. At the beginning of the 90s, we've been okay, but now they become very strict with us, you know. So even whether in the transport or at work, they look at you differently as a black male. So here, we don't have a race, they call it, because all of us, like the Indian background, the Asian background, black Asian, and as well the indigenous and the new African who arrive in Australia, might be the new rival. Just a little bit, we've got rise of some country from East Africa. When we came here, they picking name on us for in the last 5 years, for the especially for the African community. We had very hard time, but at this stage now, when the corona came and when the issue for George, when it came here, they're a little bit stay back. They're not putting a hammer more into a man. But when I see the big picture for a woman, I think Australia is one of the good, especially for black women or color.
And I want to bring Jabril into this, because the point you made, which is true here in the US as well, is that women of color bore the brunt of COVID-19, the pandemic. They were the frontline workers, the healthcare workers. They were the first to lose jobs. They were the first to really have to risk their lives to kind of keep the economy moving. Have you seen improvements in this as we approach in 2021, this post-pandemic environment, in giving women and frontline workers, in essence, the respect they deserve in your part of the world or elsewhere?
There has been a lot more awareness that has been made, but then here I have to salute the role that the National Association of Black Journalists continues to play, because a lot of efforts are being made in the diaspora community among the women. A lot of efforts are being made in Africa, which do not find their way in the media that matters. When the COVID-19 started, the international media generally predicted that the biggest catastrophe will be in Africa. That did not happen, and that was not reported adequately in Africa. So that there has been change, there has been perception, but we need to fight the apartheid of gender as forcefully as we fought apartheid in South Africa. This is where we are. And for that, we need to remember that the confinement that happened in many of the countries around the world, some of the women, our mothers, our sisters, our daughters were locked in with their abusers. And that is unacceptable. So we decided to use 3 entry points in order to deal with it. One is to deal with the youth. Youth are full of enthusiasm, of idealism, and so on, so that we engage conversations between the youth of Africa and the youth of the diaspora. That's point number 1. Point number 2, we engaged the issue of education. Education, the adolescents, the young boys need to be taught in order to be educated that it is in the interest of everybody to have equality between women and men. and also engaging the improvement of higher education. Third and final point is really to engage communities, mayors who are nearest to the communities as well. So that when you have the youth, when you have education, when you have mayors, you wrap them around a very strong communication strategy where NABJ has continued to play a role beyond the foreign correspondents who are accredited, for instance, in the African continent where I am. Then you show islands of hope that show the difference that you are talking about.
Islands of hope. You know, one of the things that jumps out to me based on what you said is that we need to tackle this type of inequality the same way that the apartheid state was taken down, which, you know, took way too long. But I want that reminds me of something Hussein wanted to mention when we talk about fighting back for equal footing all around the world. Hussein, if you could share the story you shared with me as succinctly as possible and why you think we as Black men around the world need to fight back in a different way than what you're seeing now when it comes to equality.
Yeah, you know, what I find is we always defend. We always stay back. We always complain. That thing for how long is gonna take, you know? When you look at the American you know, situation in the 80s, like we had great people who are like with, you know, they working in the election like Jesse Jackson or like what they called like maybe like all the singer like Michael Jackson, like you know, they did very good in the 80s, and then they beginning of the 90s, and then after that they stay back. The Black people, the others, they look at us very you know, formal people because we have those, you know, a great singer and great sport like Mike Tyson and all those stuff. Now what happened to them is they think they reach the goal and they stay back, and we come back to, you know, to zero, and now we still complying. This is always what happening to us as an African. We are any African male, he is ambassador, whether they are the musician people, the journalists, the sport, most of them, they must show a model of the African male to be as ambassador, you know, to show a great attitude when they play sport or music. You know, we've got a problem. Like here, for example, in Australia, or what I've seen in Europe as well, some of them, they've got a hobby of music or a hobby of sport. And when he apply, he is not success. When they reject him, he keep complying to say, oh, it's discrimination there. It doesn't work like that. If you are good in a job, no one can reject you. They might, but you will win at the end. And then what happens is to us, when we see one Black male success, whether in business, whether in sport, whether in music, we are the one who are attacking more than anyone. We are the one who we try to let him down. We shouldn't do that. We shouldn't be like the greatest job, what Colin Powell did. He was in the other part. When you've seen Barack Obama, he moved there. He moved there to support him and his success, and he win. You know, so in the way how we are doing to each other now, when I've got a clinic, a prof or doctor, Black male, I didn't go to him. I drive a few kilometers to the other, you know, color. Instead, I go to him. I didn't give him a confidence, and I'm not confident about him. That attitude, we have to stop it. We have to stop complying. When we do a job, we have to do it proper or leave it. You know, complying at this stage now, we've got a lot of, educated people. We've got a lot of young, now they're watching us, what we are doing. The problem is from the African communities, wherever we are, who are in a position, they take advantage only because they know, only selfish, only we are not thinking to improve the generation and to build a history for them.
I think that's a very, I think that's a very interesting point. I do see Lennox nodding his head and kind of taking in what Hussein is saying. Lennox, what do you make of that point of view?
Well, I think it's a fair point. A friend of mine used to be Secretary of HUD, Housing and Urban Development, in the Bush administration, Black guy. And he told me that when he got this job, he was getting a lot of pushback from Black people, not white people, being criticized, for example, for not living in the hood. He told me, well, you know, I have the means to live in a nice, you know, continue to move into nicer neighborhoods as I earn more and so on, like any other American, and I should not have to justify that, and I should not have to deal with Black people, fellow Black men in particular, who are grabbing my ankles as I try to climb the ladder. So it's a very fair point, and it's well worth noting as we move forward, I think.
And Jabril, what do you make of that? Is there enough support among, I think maybe Senegal is a different dynamic, but in countries where Black men are the minority and some are able to succeed, do you have a sense of this jealousy and animosity compared to support and encouragement?
Well, I lead an organization whose main task is to breathe life into what the diaspora means. The African Union Commission has declared that the diaspora, that is the sons and daughters who were forcibly removed from the continent for over 500 years ago, should be part of the continent. So what does that mean? It means that we have to go to a number of points to deal with, first of all, the perceptions that happen. There are two levels of perceptions that Mohammed also mentioned, and I would like to come back to them. There are perceptions from within Africa, and then the perceptions from, say, since we're talking about the United States, from the United States. In Africa, in generally, men are told that they're supposed to be strong leaders, and that they're supposed to be providers, and that they should take care of their families. That's point number one. Point number two, men are told that they're not allowed to show their feelings. Showing your feelings is a sign of weakness. So generally speaking, when boys are growing up, that's what they grow up with generally. And of course, like any generalization, there are many, many exceptions to it, but I'm just making it at that general level. But regarding the United States, very often the United States and the industrialized world, Black men are often portrayed as violent, as brutal, and as not having enough education. So that we need to bridge that gap at the level of Black men, and then also bridge the gap in terms of bridging the gap between women and men. And this is where we feel that when you are in the area of sport, when you are in the area of culture, then that's the fastest way to bridge the gender gap. Hence the importance to give a red card to all forms of discrimination and violence against women and girls, so that we need to start very early. When you have young boys, young adolescents, they need to learn about that. And then secondly, they also need to move forward to use sport and culture in order to deal with discrimination and violence against women and girls.
A very good point there. As we wrap up our conversation this hour, I'm going to incorporate now as many questions as possible that folks are currently sending in on the chat. Remember to, tweet about this under hashtag Inspire Black Men. But just quickly, Hussein, did you say you wanted to jump on to
Jabril's and that one? Yes. What happened is, when we say like Black men need to be strong, or like you've got a responsibility and all that. The world is changing now. We have to, move with the new system. Now CEDAW come, like the human right for women. It's a new law coming, human right, you know what I mean? So like man is not going to say like, we will have to separate now. The culture and the system and the law in the world is changing. So we have to, you can't just take things and leave others, So whether we're going to move together or we're going to stay back in the old culture to bull pack, you know what I mean? Men like before, all we know is that like women who are serving at home much than a man, but that's changing now, you know what I mean? Like we are most of us now like a West. Even if you go to Senegal now, so they are adopted to the West. You can't just leave things and put things. We have to educate our people. And I think the United Nations, what we're talking about this topic today, I wish if they have a side in the United Nations building, because it's a very important to the other ambassadors to listen to it. What happened is we have to, what I'm concerned is, like, we have to follow the new regulation about the human right and with the other Western countries or in the other side of the world. But we can't just stick in this is our culture. You know, now you can keep your culture, but you have to follow the rule, and we must know the rule if we are as a black male to success and drive our dream. Otherwise, we cannot just take things and leave things, and we need to go up as well. We can't go like that. We have to decide what we need to grow. Thank you.
And Lennox, I want to bring you in as we talk about the world is changing. I want to incorporate questions now that people are sending in. Maria Torres says, in the US, we see a lot of solidarity among young people against racism. Do you see the same where you are? I mean, one thing I notice is as the G7 is taking place, President Biden is making the case that democracies aren't guaranteed. Autocracies are growing in power around the world. And there seems to be a link between autocracies and racism when you look at countries like Russia, very homogeneous, very low levels, China. But so do you see the same kind of generational differences, though, where young people are rallying against racism and to make progress? When we think about Hong Kong and the protests there, those democracy protests were stamped out, and many of the folks behind them are in jail. So what does it look like where you are?
Yes.
Previous question.
In a word, yes. What's going on in this region is most of these sort of freedom movements, pro-democracy endeavors are in fact led by younger people and often students. Hong Kong is an example. Myanmar or Burma is another example. China, indeed. Even in places like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, the kids, if you like, tend to be on the cutting edge of these changes, including race relations, but also human rights, freedom of expression, and of course they're being persecuted for it because concurrently with this sort of change in consciousness is a rise in authoritarianism. So we've got more and more governments in this region: Thailand, Burma, Cambodia, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia. They're all becoming increasingly authoritarian, and so there isn't that much room for these younger people to maneuver, because there's no hesitation on the part of many of these governments to throw them into jail.
Jabril, where you are in Senegal, a country I've had the pleasure of visiting only a few times, but was impressed in Dakar at how many people were out, the vibrant colors, the working out on the beach. Are young people driving change in Senegal? I know in general in the African continent, compared to the rest of the world, it's a relatively young continent, with most people, I think, 35 or younger. Are you seeing that drive for change from younger generations?
Big drive for change with younger generation. After all, this is the continent, Africa, where up to 70% of the population is under 35 years old. So it's a very, very young continent. But Mohammed, your point regarding the perceptions is a good one. But you know, perceptions are often not based on reality, but when they stick, they're very difficult to remove. So that we're in a changing world right now where there is a solidarity movement to fight racism. What we need to do is to build on that, to have some very concrete steps, because enthusiasm is like the breaking news of the day. If we don't build on it, everybody moves on. And at the African Renaissance and Diaspora Network, as I said, we built it on two areas. One, women of the diaspora have not had their day in terms of visibility of the efforts of the women of the diaspora internationally. So that we built a series of consultations where we had virtual summits where the women of the diaspora are looked at in terms of discrimination, violence, what is the impact of the economic impact, inequality, and also the issue of mental health. of COVID-19 on women. And then when you look at the youth are very enthusiastic, Errol, but we need to be very concrete. So we took a number of steps. One, what are the current good practices that we can have on national and regional levels in terms of fighting racism? No two situations are the same, but if we share those situations with the youth of Africa and the diaspora, it will have an impact. Secondly, what are the challenges facing the youth when they're fighting racism in Africa, racism around the world, and then show those challenges, especially as they relate to women and girls. Finally, also promote exchanges. It can be very lonely out there with the youth. So promote exchanges among the youth of Africa, promote exchanges among the youth of the diaspora. That is why on the 19th of June, when we're looking at the issue of environment, we're convening 200 young people from within Africa and from the diaspora to look at the impact of the environment of climate change on the youth. So we need to be very, very concrete and very specific. And in the area of media as well, be very, very specific, because otherwise there is solidarity, but then, every day there's a breaking news and then people just move on.
One thing, Jabril, that we notice from young people is they are very passionate about LGBTQ rights. I mean, by now we've talked about gender equality, racism, and the climate, but is that a component on the African continent where there doesn't appear to be as much progress toward rights of people who, are attracted to the same sex? Is that a component that you see progress on right now?
There are two dimensions to the issue of LGBT inside the continent. One is that a violation of any human right is a violation of a human right of all of us. But at the same time, the United Nations has determined that in every country, we need to move to take into account the cultural norms of each one of the countries, so that Africa, unfortunately, is the continent where there have been bigger challenges in terms of addressing the issue of LGBTQs and so on. But this is something where the United Nations is coming as a guest of African countries and trying to address these issues, bearing in mind national legislations and other issues.
And that question, I want to thank Sharia for sending that in. Lennox, in your part of the world, specifically even in Thailand, would it be a location that is leading the way in LGBTQ rights at all, or is that not the case?
It's an interesting question, and it's a complicated response. This is one of the most permissive societies, as you know, I think, as it relates to LGBT matters, and has been for decades. At the same time, successive governments, and to your point earlier, particularly authoritarian ones, typically coming with an agenda that we need to attack vice and eliminate vice and reduce vice. And we don't want Thailand to continue to be known as a country where you go to express yourself sexually, or to have liaisons, or to be free and dress however you like. So at the same time, you've got this sort of free society, and so many people feel perfectly comfortable being gay or transgender and various other categories, including from a very young age, because there's a greater tolerance within families, certainly favorably compared with Africa, for example. But there's a less tolerance governmentally and at the top of the leadership ladder, if you like. And so there's this sort of tension between an acceptance, even a permissiveness, and the efforts of the authorities to put their thumb on this.
And before we wrap up, I want to get in as many more of these attendees' questions as possible. And Hussein, I'll throw this one to you because it deals with something that here in the US is described as the talk. It's when parents of color have to sit their children down at some point and explain to them the unequal systems in society that they're about to face. And as such, it directs them to behave differently, more cautiously around police, for example. You mentioned your children feeling differently about things than you do, Hussein. So do you have the talk where you are? Do you have something equivalent? And if so, what does that sound like?
Well, what happened here now, even when the LBT start here, they you know, in the last 2 years, when they bring these issues as well at school, like to us, because they all thinking we don't accept it, but them, we had discussion, like always they said that what you had outside there, it's outside. We are here in Australia. So they pick in things that to me is nothing. I don't look at it, it's a big issue, because I came from a hard, you know, hardship life. So that's a big gap that we've got. So there is no, you know, closer, you know, communication with them. That's why I was always said, even now as a black male in the world, we have to not only pick in the educated people to talk or communicate with. We have to take, you know, the young. I wish now today in this you know, topic, we should have one of the young youth to have a discussion with us, from the girls or boys, to listen to them as well and listen to them opinion. So please, you know, I recommend it for next time when we have that, to have one of them or one of each two as well. We can learn from them and we can listen to them directly. Then we talking on behalf of them, because they have a lot of things they hide. They didn't tell us. Sometimes they have a problem in outside in the street. Say, for example, like last week, my son asked me, he said, we in the train, me and my sister, and the train, there is other people. They didn't go to them. They said, they coming to us direct, and they asking us, do you have a ticket for the train? What does that mean? I said to him, why you look at it in discrimination? Why he just came? No, he said to me, no, that's not excuse. He came from there, he passed all those, you know, 100 people, and he coming to us, he asking us direct. And that's why, you know, the way how they think the generation is a bit different and difficult. But the good thing is, when George Floyd stories come, like in Australia, especially the Black African or the indigenous, they're all united. And I think they have so many conferences about these issues to stop racism. For the new generation, Australia, maybe there is a good future. And if we continue like the way how we are doing now, to educate them, to give them support, to make them strong. But if they don't get support 100%, they're not going to success, they're going to fail. So what happened now, we have a gap between us and the generation who are born here in the Asian region, or in Australia, especially the black male.
And Lennox, I hear you listening intently to what Hussein was saying there. What are your thoughts on how to bridge that gap between the experiences everyone here has lived through and the differences that young people are coming into the world, the difference of expectations, and how we can help bridge that?
I think, unfortunately, it's very tough because of the variety of systems and attitudes in different places. If you take this country, this region, you know, the young people are stifled so routinely. You take your life into your hands if you make too much of an objection. I mean, if you take Thailand for a moment, they employ a law that's lèse majesté, which is insulting the monarchy, which has been freely used now to, you know, that's a proper law. But now it can apply to the government, and it can apply to all kinds of what appear to be extraneous, poorly connected offenses. And so there's a chilling effect that one gets from that. And so it's very difficult, depending on where you are, to get past these strictures. If you take, let me branch it a little bit, in Brazil, where, you know, has this fake reputation as the melting pot. There is no real prospect of young people being educated to understand, have a better appreciation for racial and cultural issues, since in that particular country, there's white and there's black, and everybody's racing from being black, and there are some 8 or 9 categories of brown between white and black, and so everyone tries to be in one of these brown categories. And so you're instilled with this sense of a failure to have a proper allegiance to your culture and to your color and your race and so on. And so I think we've got a very tough task. I don't mind saying that I consider race and racism the scourge of civilization, really.
And I agree with you on that. It does appear that we've run out of time. I want to thank everyone for sending in the questions. Certainly thank our panelists as we talk about inspiring Black men. I mean, look at the men that we've been able to listen to. I'm certainly inspired and think I'd be well off. I feel like I'm looking into my future in 3 different possibilities here as I look across the screen. Each of you, so well versed in each topic that we've discussed. I want to thank Jabril Diallo there in Senegal, Lennox Samuels in Bangkok, Thailand, and of course Hussein Hubadin Samsam in Melbourne, Australia, staying up the latest or earliest for us. I really want to thank you all for being a part of this conversation, and to all of not just our attendees who have been listening in. And of course, I have to thank the Black Male Media Project, Ken Lemon, Xavier Higgs, Kevin Hirams, Aaron Day, Derek Russell, Terry Collins, Avery Braxton, John Ewan, and Larry Spruill for making this possible. It will continue to live on NABJ platforms. Please continue to share this under Inspire Black Men. Thank you all for your time today. And here now is a closing thought and message.
A special thank you to our sponsor partners, Yahoo and TEGNA Foundation